Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. So the topic for today will be Terraform. So recently we've been working on a plugin for Terraform. And if, like me, you started with ACI with UI, then maybe you wanted to do some automation, and you were using things like, you started maybe with Postman. And then what's the next step? Yeah, we also have released Ansible modules. But with my, let's say, VMware background, I was also provisioning a lot of virtual machines for labs. And I was like, OK, Ansible, it's cool, but how about the state? Right? Ansible, it's great to deploy stuff. But at some point, if you have to destroy something, what do? Right? You have to create other playbook that will be doing the opposite. Right? And that's the goal of Terraform. Terraform maintains the states that helps you maintain the life cycle of your environment. Right? So today I'm going to be joined by Devarshi, my colleague, and I'm Nick. We're both working for ACI Technical Marketing. And the goal for today is really like 3 main points. So first, get a good understanding of Terraform capability, maybe a quick introduction to Terraform. So how many of you already know Terraform? A little bit, maybe? Yeah, OK, probably like 40%.
How many of you know about the ACI object model, played around with ACI?
Oh, OK, that's good. Yeah. That's a good point. One or the other, I think with both of the concepts should be fine. And then we'll go into how ACI can be managed by infrastructure as code, which is the goal of Terraform, have this declarative model to manage ACI lifecycle. And then we're going to have a demo, probably about 15, 20 minutes, if the demo gods are OK. So I'm not sure. I've run the demo probably hundreds of times, never one problem. This morning I tested it. I kept running into problems. So we'll see. So yeah, let's get started. So quick introduction on what is Terraform. So Terraform, essentially, it's a tool that allows you to compose and combine infrastructure resources and maintain the desired state, right? So as you deploy your infrastructure, the actual state of it is maintained into what we call a state file, right? So it allows you at any point in time, at least if someone does something manual, for example, in your environment, to maintain a delta between your configuration, which is the desired state, and the real state of your environment. Now, there are also different things you can do. The first thing is planning, right? Say, what if? What if I'm deploying this configuration in my environment? What should be the end results? So it's not effectively doing it. It's like, if you think like a dry run, right? This is what I'm going to do. This is the resources that I will need to compute. And then there's also another action, which is Terraform apply, that will allow you to effectively apply the configuration changes. Another thing is that it's been developed for reusability, in the sense that when you have started to work with Terraform, you're creating all your files. You can combine them into specific module, and we will see that modules are like black boxes. You have inputs and outputs, and then you can just reuse them as many times as you want. And for ACI, for example, at some point, if you want to migrate from, let's say, network-centric environment towards a more application-centric environment, you can just import a module that will do this migration for you, right? You program it once, and then you can reuse it. Yeah, and finally, Terraform is based on 2 things: the core components, which basically gives you the ability to do all these actions, so plan, destroy, diff, for example, but it heavily relies on providers and modules. So by default, if you use Terraform, you won't be able to provision basically anything. You need to import modules for basically everything. So vSphere, for example, AWS, and actually a lot of companies are using it. So I mentioned AWS. There is, I got here all the lists right there. Here, so AWS, Heroku, Azure, Nutanix, Alibaba Cloud. I mean, anything you can think of, at some point, they may have a Terraform plugin. And this will allow you to manage the corresponding resources in a declarative model, right? So how to install it? It's pretty easy. You just go on the Terraform website, pick your platform, unzip move the binary into a location in your path, and you can start use Terraform. That's pretty easy.
And for all the geeks out there, Terraform is basically statically compiled Go binary, and the plugins are basically using RPC to communicate with the Terraform core.
Yeah, and basically Terraform also relies on APIs, right? So anything should be able to be reached by APIs. So when you're calling Terraform, Terraform will basically talk to other components via REST APIs, right? So let's go a bit more deeper. So what's a Terraform file look like? A Terraform, what we call a plan. So you declare your resources, and resources are basically representing what you want to manage on your environment. So as an example here, this is an OpenStack resource networking that we are declaring. Then you just give it some attributes to that resource. Here, this is the subnet, another resource that will represent the subnet, like the DNS name server, API version, all those kind of things. The language used for this is called HCL, which is Hashicorp configuration language, but more or less it really looks like JSON. So basically, Terraform can also be written entirely with JSON, but this way of doing things is more for human. JSON is more like a machine processed language. That is, it's better to use directly the Terraform language. So as I was saying, you have many providers. You can access them from the Hashicorp website, and most of the time, also those external provider also maintains individually on GitHub their own. I mean, that's the same module, but maybe with more recent changes. And basically, as we do exactly the same, right? The configuration, AAA configuration is always required as part of the provider definition. So in the Terraform file, how you connect to the provider, like the username, the password, should be also set at that moment. And ACI, in the case of ACI, we support both user-based authentication, but obviously we recommend that you use the certificate-based authentication, which is much more secure. So what does a Terraform plan look like? I mean, this is the project folder. So typically, you run all your files, you declare all your files into a folder that you call the project folder. So you will find the main Terraform file, where the TF plan, where you will declare all your resources and what you want to manage in your environment. And then you have two variables file, right? So the first one, essentially, so in the case of ACI here, example resource, you want an ACI, the type of resource is an ACI tenant, and the name you want to give to this resource name will be demo tenant to identify basically the resource. Then the friendly name, as it will appear in ACI, may be there, reference as a variable, right? You can put the description. Here in the variable, .tf, you will declare basically the default. So you have to think about the variable .tf like the file where you declare default variable that can be overridden by something more specific. So why can you do this is for reusability. So if you want to reuse the Terraform file in multiple places, but you know that you may have the name of the tenant that will change, you can just use the variable.tf where you declare the variable, like empty variable is just instantiating an empty variable, but here you effectively set the name. So this is why you have those two files. So it's optional, but my recommendation, if you want to scale and also reuse your configuration file, then you better have differentiate both files, one for the default variables, one for the more specific one. So in that example, basically what we do, we want a new tenant. We reference the variable here in the name. Then the default is just declaring the tenant name variable. And here we effectively put a name in it. So as a result, the name of my tenant, as the name in ACI, will be tenant-1. Then, once you apply the configuration, you apply the configuration, you will have two more files, right? Because remember, Terraform, the goal is to maintain a state so that at any point in time, you know what's been configured and what is effectively running in your environment. So to do that and to be able to do all the difference, so Terraform will maintain a Terraform state and also a backup, right? Because obviously, if you lose let's say both the state file and the backup file, you're a little bit screwed, right? So this is why you always have to pay attention to those two files here and be very careful. Okay, so yeah, variable.tf. So as I was explaining, this is more for the basic declaration of all the variables. So if you don't want to have any default, you can just leave them empty, for example, right? So here, I know I will be working always in a VMware environment, so I want my provider for my VM. So everyone is familiar with the ACI VMM domain? Yes? Okay, cool. So in that case, we just set by default the provider as VMware because we know that we are working in a VMware environment, so we can just keep the default to that, right? And then for the rest, we just rely on the Terraform vars to populate the rest of the information. So typically here you will see like the name of a vSphere compute cluster, the name of the folder where you want to deploy your virtual machines, and then ACI-related information. Because the goal, obviously, is not to only manage ACI resources with Terraform, is to combine ACI resources with anything else, right? And obviously in a Terraform, in a virtualized environment, typically you will also see VMware resources. So the good thing is that with Terraform now, you will be able to deploy both virtual machines and the network at the same time. And as people remove virtual machine or remove application, you can keep your network in sync with that information. So typically, if you want to delete your application, you also want to delete your security, you also want to delete the EPG that are linked to this application, because it doesn't make sense to keep those things empty, right? Okay, so now there are two types of resources you can do in Terraform. So first of all, we have the basic resource, which are read-write. They can be used for interpolation. I'm just explaining what is interpolation in the slide after. And basically, this is read-write, so you can destroy them, you can create them, and they are displayed by Terraform show and Terraform state. And basically, the data source are more or less the same, except they are read-only resources. So as you do destroy or create, it won't do, it's nullipotent. It won't create anything in your environment. So typically this is, you're going to be using data sources to get information about your environment. So you can reuse those information as part of the provisioning of a real resource. Right, so you may want to get the VMware data center name so that you can deploy a folder in that data center and then later on some virtual machine in that folder, right? But you don't want to create the vSphere data center. Same with ACI, you don't necessarily want to create the VMM domain. You may want to refer to it. So this would be a data source, right? So another very important notion in Terraform is what we call interpolation. So interpolation basically gives you the ability from a resource to reference another resource that has not been created yet, for example, right? It will allow Terraform to maintain an order of dependency. So every time, for example, here, I want to create a resource that is a bridge domain. The ID would be BD1. But I want to create it in a particular tenant because I want to respect the ACI object model, which is tenant and then bridge domain, right? So what I'm doing, I'm referring in the bridge domain, I'm referring to the tenant. And obviously, and this is doing interpolation. But now, what does that mean? At the moment where I will want to create this resource, the tenants need to exist, right? And Terraform will know by doing this interpolation, I will create a dependency so that the tenant needs to be created first, right? Yeah, so here I'm referring both the tenant and also the VRF that needs to be there before. And basically, by doing this interpolation, we'll allow Terraform to create a direct acyclic graph of dependency, right? It just means that at some point, Terraform will know that to get to the point where the VM and the EPG are deployed, it needs to go through all this different process, all those dependency, right? So by doing interpolation, you can create this dependency, and you can also explicitly mention that a particular resource needs some dependency on another, right? Yeah, and so that's basically the main option. Plan, apply, show and console if you want some sort of interactive a relation with the Terraform environment, right? So this is just a plan. Plan will give you, I just took this example because it will tell you it's not being applied, so it doesn't know yet. It needs to be computed first, right? So here you will see computed. Here the name, I've declared the name as a variable, it's just a string, it already knows what is the value. But for the rest it needs to be computed, so you need to apply it. And once it gets applied, then you will see some more information in creating, and then you will see more information appearing there. And at the end, once everything has been computed, then you will see all the information that has been gathered. Basically the console just gives you, like, if you want at some point to give to get a name or an ID or any specific information from Terraform directly without having to do a cat from the state file, you can just use this one. Right? Okay.
So Nick, before we jump into ACI, just wanted to ask you a question about Terraform state file. If you run some configuration on ACI through Terraform, and then you go ahead and change something on the GUI, what happens there? Okay,
so if you change something in Terraform, in ACI directly without changing it in Terraform, then you will run into issues, right? Because the state file won't be aligned with the ACI, right? So if you were to delete an object, for example, and you reapply the Terraform configuration file, then the issue is that Terraform won't know that the resource has been deleted. So for Terraform, there won't be any difference. Now what you have to do is basically delete. You can delete manually. If someone deletes a resource in ACI, you have to manually delete it from the state file, and at that moment you will be aligned with the configuration. The configuration will be aligned with the actual state of your environment.
So Terraform enforces the state. Whatever is there in the state
but
file.
if you modify something in the environment, the state file won't be updated, right? Because the single source of truth for Terraform is the state file, and the only way you can interact with it is either with the Terraform plan or via specific command, Terraform state rm, that will delete a specific resource inside Terraform, right?
Cool.
And also to complete this, you can, if you have existing resources that you want to import into Terraform, there's also an import command that will allow you to import individual resources into the state file.
Cool. So jumping into ACI, I know some of you raised your hands initially about understanding ACI and the object model, but I just wanted to give you a refresher because this is really important, and this is how the provider for ACI works. So everything in ACI is a managed object. So if you go into the GUI, you see tenants being created, application profiles, EPGs. All of those things are managed objects in ACI. And these objects, be it tenant, application profile, EPG, are linked together in a hierarchy, which forms the management information tree for ACI. So if you look at any entry point APIs that you use for ACI, you get through the root, and then you have different nodes underneath. So if you want to play around with the policies of the tenant, you have the policy universe. If you want to change the configuration of the fabric, you have the fabric, and then the hypervisors and other nodes that are there in the hierarchy. Again, in the policy universe, you have the tenant application profile. So you have the parent-child relationship being formed between different objects. And then you have the relationships between different peers as well as objects which are not in the hierarchy. This is really important when you are designing or working with ACI and automation tools. So just wanted to highlight this, and just another example. Tenant is the parent, its child is VRF, then you have BDs, and within that you have EPGs and VLANs. So object model, hierarchy, relations, really important. So what does Terraform do? So Terraform leverages this object model and hierarchy to figure out which resource it needs to configure on ACI. So if you think about the object model, it's basically your directory structure. If you want to find a file in some directory, you have to give the entire path. Similarly, something like that is a DN, distinguished name for us. So what Terraform does is it identifies a particular resource in ACI by its DN. So here I'm doing an example of Terraform state show for a filter entry. And if you look at that, the ID for that computed filter entry is uni, which is the entry point. Then you have the name of the tenant, then the filter, and the filter entry. So you go down that entire tree. And this is how Terraform recognizes a particular resource for ACI. And then you have different parameters or attributes associated with that particular object. So for example, for this filter entry, we are allowing the ports from HTTPS to HTTPS, ether type is IP, we are saying that the filter DN is this, and these are the other properties that are associated with it. So again, object model, hierarchy, DN, that is how Terraform identifies a particular resource for ACI.
Yeah, and also what is very important is if you were to browse the object model into ACI, you would see exactly the same thing. So basically we are, any object, any attribute that is part of the object model in ACI is exactly the same in Terraform. So we export every attribute from the object model and will be represented into Terraform. So obviously you don't have to fill everything because ACI, like if you were doing a post to APIC, it will fill the rest by default values. Right?
And this is really important because everything that's available to you through GUI as well as through the object model is available to you in Terraform for configuring. So next up is what are the resources that we have? I think we might need a slight update. We've been constantly working on it, so this column has been updated. So as Nick mentioned earlier, right, you have resources which are read-write and data sources which are read-only. So we have created resources for tenants, VRFs, application profiles, bridge domains, L3 outs, all of these, and ACI REST. So if you want to configure, let's say, tenant, you have the resource here, but what if you want to configure a AAA policy? You don't see a resource for that here, but you could use ACI REST, which is basically the entry point into the REST API for that particular object, and you can use this particular resource to configure it. Data sources, again, as Nick mentioned, we have data sources available for most of them, and if you're using something like VMM domain, you want to use it as a data source, which is read-only, not as a resource. So let's dig deeper into how you can start using a Terraform config or the ACI resources for Terraform. The first thing that you need to do is you need to connect to your APIC, and there are two ways of doing it. First is through username password-based authentication, and the second is through cert-based authentication. So here, I'll declare the provider for ACI. This is mandatory, you need this. And then you give your username, and if you're doing a cert-based authentication, the path to the private key, and the name of the cert object. Once you've done that, you need to give the URL for the APIC. That is how it connects to. So all clear on this. This is how you connect to APIC. These are the mandatory parameters that are required.
Yeah, and this is directly in your TF file, right, as part of it. Yeah.
Is the provider version somehow related to the ACI version? Because if there are new objects?
So that is a very good question. So the question is, are the providers related to the ACI objects? So what we've done is we've started building these providers against 4.0, but since the object model is pretty consistent, it will work with previous versions as well. So it will be, so the newer attributes, at least for the ones that we have, ACI, ACI tenant, VRF, all those will remain constant. If there are new attributes, we can update it against that particular release that comes out for ACI. But if it's not, then you can use ACI REST.
Yeah, I mean, as always, anything that we build on top of ACI, whether that's the SDK, plugin, anything around programmability, need to be part of the normal QA process for any new release to check that effectively it continue to work as expected, right?
So the ones that we have published are tested out against 4.0. So everything from 4.0 onwards will be supported, and a couple of times we've run this against an APIC on 3.2. It works fine. So next up is how do you manage the relationships, right? So if you're aware of how to create an EPG, it asks you a lot of parameters when you go on the UI. You have to specify the bridge domain that the CPG is related to. You have to specify the consumer contract, provider contract, all of those things. So how does that translate into Terraform resource world? So here, I have a resource declared for ACI application EPG, EPG1, and you give the application profile DN, which is the parent of this object, right? So you have EPG, you need to provide the DN for its parent object. You give the name of the EPG, and then you define the relationships, right? So for example, if you want to define a relationship to the BD, the attributes are present here. Every attribute that starts with a relationship defines a relationship to some other object. So in this case, I'm defining my relationship to a particular bridge domain, which has already been defined as a resource earlier. So ACI bridge domain is the name of the resource. This is the type of the resource. This is the name of the resource, and this is how I'm identifying it in the EPG. Similarly, you can have only one BD linked to an EPG. But if you have multiple relationships, you define it in a list. Again, relationship to contracts, you define it in a list. You can provide the resources for those contracts.
Yeah. And here it's a good example of interpolation, right? Because we see here the only, I would say, hard-coded value that we have is the name of the EPG. The rest are reference to resources that are, somewhere part of the Terraform file somewhere else. So here we also, we do two things. We provide Terraform a way to guess the dependency. So it knows that EPG will depending on the application profile. It will depending on the bridge domain. No, this is this one is a variable, so it will depend on this value. It will depend on this VMM domain and on this contract, right? This is one side of things. And the second one is that, this relation allows you, as in the object model, to go from one tree to another, right? So this is, it's not like the parent-children type of things. It's more like you go from one tree to another, right?
I need to be closer to, okay. So how do you install this ACI provider? You need certain prerequisites for it. The first is you need the latest version of Go, because Terraform depends on Go. And the second is you need Terraform version 0.11.7. That is what we've built and tested it out against. Once you have all these dependencies, we have the code for the provider available on GitHub. This is the repo that's there. And you can basically check out that provider. Once you check it out, you go into the directory for that provider and do a make build. You need to build those providers into your Go.
We changed the name, right? Now it's master.
Yes,
here.
it's master now.
It's master now.
Constant work going on. Once you have the Terraform provider built, as Nick mentioned earlier, Terraform is based on core and plugin-based architecture, right? So you need to point this provider to the plugin directory, or you need to add it in the plugin directory. So you'd add it in the Terraform plugin directory, which is present here. And once you have that, you can create a working directory where you have all your Terraform config listed out.
Yeah, just to mention here why we have all those value here, the variable, is because Terraform is returning Go, right? So you have to have Go to compile the plugin, and once you have the binary, you just place it in the right place, right?
And then you go ahead and do a Terraform init, which will go through the list of resources that are there, make sure these resources are in the plugin directory. If not, it'll go ahead and download those for you. And this is where we come to the fun part.
Yeah, so now pray the demo gods. Okay, so what we are going to do, hopefully, so it's a two-step thing. The first one is really the basic foundation. I want to create tenant in ACI, create the component up to, so BD, VRF, two-tier application with two EPGs, add an HTTP contract, attach EPG to BD, deploy this EPG into my VMware environment. So I want also to manage, not manage, but I want to deploy this EPG, this pore group into my VDS, attach and also deploy some virtual machines at the same time, because that's the goal. You don't want to only use Terraform for, you can, right? You can use Terraform only for ACI, but you want to combine things, infrastructure resources, so that you can have a declarative model for your whole environment, right? So we're going to deploy VMs as well, and test connectivity maybe, we'll see. And then the second part of the demo will be doing module, because reusability is key in your environment. You don't want to do things manually. Every work you do, because if you're as lazy as me, right, you want to reuse the things you're doing. You don't want to work for nothing, right? So we're going to see this as a second part, and this would be this example where you have a network-centric environment, and you want to migrate your VMs into a new set of EPGs that are defined in a much more granular fashion. So instead of like any permits, or maybe some broad rules in your firewall or in your distributed firewall in ACI, you want something much more granular, right? So you want to create those EPG, put them in place, and then migrate the VM to those EPGs. So I'm going to switch to the demo environment. Okay. So here I'm connected to my environment. I'm in my...
Nick, it's not being projected.
It's not mirrored. Okay. Is that okay? Can you see in the back? That's fine? Okay. So I have to do like this. Wow. So you can see all my files there. I have my Terraform file. I've got already a state, but it's just backup. Basically, it's almost empty. I've just destroyed the resource before. And then, Terraform vars variable.tf. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a Terraform show. I've got nothing, right? That's good. If I do now a Terraform plan, okay. So it's telling me I've got 13 to add, 0 to change, 0 to destroy. So if I go into this, what's the plan? Essentially, this is create some, okay, let's go up. That was the previous one. So I'm relying on some resources or data sources here to identify various components in my VMware environment. I've got the name of my EPG that will be computed for me, because I will show you inside the file. I know that in ACI, the name of the pore group is deterministic. It's always name of the tenant, name of the application network profile, name of the EPG, right? So that's very easy to bind them together. Then I will need to create here a plus. So I will need to create the EPG, and as you see there, I've got some interpolation, so I don't know yet. And then I've got some particular value that will be computed because they need feedback from APIC. So that's all the EPG, all the ACI application, and all the components. And finally, I'm also deploying some virtual machines there, and this is all the information for the virtual machine that I'm going to be deploying, right? So here is just the plan. So now let's just apply it. Okay, apply, and it's a bit annoying to always have to do this. So here, this is a small thing that we have in ACI, like in Ansible, basically. Nginx tends to throttle the number of requests when you're talking to APIC from anything, basically talking APIs to our Nginx. So parallelism equal 1 will guarantee that there won't be any throttling when talking to APIC, right? Cross finger. Now, while it's deploying, I'm going to show you the file. If there is an issue, I would just relaunch it. So let's take a look. Should take a couple of minutes here. So if I go into the file, let's focus on the ACI bit. So I have my provider definition there, all the information so that I can connect to APIC. And then, again, this is the declarative model where I'll be configuring all my ACI resources. Name of the tenant, I don't need anything else. Then so this is the child, VRF. I need the name of my VRF, and I need the tenant. So I'm just referring ACI tenant, the type of resource, the name, the name of the resource in Terraform, which is this one, and then the ID, because the ID corresponds to the DN in Terraform, right? Then same thing here, ACI bridge domain. This is the level underneath. So we depend on the tenant again. So this is interpolation to that resource. And then in that case, the BD, we have a relation source to the VRF, right? Because we tie a bridge domain to a particular VRF. And I'm doing using interpolation to the VRF name that is defined there, and then et cetera, et cetera. Right. Just take a look at this. Okay, looks like it's fine. So let's take a look at the current situation. So I think this is my VM1 still creating, but normally I should already have some ACI, yes, has been computed. So let's connect to Epic. Obviously, it's the. I should have just mirrored the stuff because it's painful. There you go. So now what I can see in Epic already is that I should have Terraform tenant there, right? In my Terraform tenants, I can see, hopefully, come on. That's the wireless. Lucky. Let's go there. Application profile. I've got app 1 that has been created. I can see my EPGs. No, come on. And yeah, this is the topology. So I've got my contract that have been created. That contract, I've got my HTTPS filter as defined in Terraform. And I've got my 2 EPGs, normally EPG1, EPG2, and if everything worked well, I should already see an endpoint in that EPG that will be the virtual machine that has been deployed, right? So if you go to operational tab, I should see, yeah. So I've got the MAC address, and as part, the good thing about Terraform is that you can, when you deploy the VM, you can already set the IP address, right? So in the bridge domain, if I go under the bridge domain there, under the network, I've also provisioned the bridge domain. So this guy there already has its default gateway, right? So at the same time, I've provisioned virtual machine entities, but it could be, I don't have to, it can be only ACI, but in that case, I want to correlate both events at the same time, deploy VM at the same time as the network, right? Because as application people, usually they don't want to wait for the network to be provisioned because usually take weeks, right? So here, what I've done is provision both the default gateway and set the IP addresses of the VMs so that they can use their default gateway to access the network. I've also created all the contract required for this, right? So now if I go in my VMware environment, what I will see, hopefully, is that you can see that here, I've got 2 pore groups that have been created corresponding to the EPG, because I've tied those EPG to my VMware environment, right? So by default, ACI has created 2 EPGs, and in Terraform, I've linked my VM to those EPG, right? And so how does that happen? So yeah, apply complete. It worked. Can't believe it. Demo goals are with me today. That's good. So if you look just after, so this is all the ACI configuration there, contract, filter, vSphere there. This is the part that is interesting. So now, this is all my ACI part on at the top. Bottom, now I start vSphere. vSphere, same thing, provider, I need to connect to it. Some data sources to identify what resource I want to leverage. And here, this is what is important, right? So I force a dependency between my VM network, right? From I need the EPG first, so then I can attach my network, the VM network, to that EPG, right? And basically, the name, I want to tie the name of my pore group to the ACI EPG, right? So, and basically what I'm doing, I know, as I said, that in ACI, it's predictable. You can predict the name of the port group. So you just do this. You say, I'm going to be using name of the tenant, pipe, name of the application profile, pipe, name of that EPG, right? But nothing is hard-coded. Everything is tied to variable, right? So this is why I could connect directly my VM to my EPG. And now, if I were to do a Terraform destroy, it will destroy not only all the virtual machines, but all the objects that has been defined as part of ACI, as long as they are resources. For all the data sources, they will stay intact, right? Okay, so that was for the first part. Now what I want to do is, so this is this use case again. I've got my EPG with my VM, and let's assume that I didn't have any, I mean, the contract was any permits. I want to migrate this application now into a new application network profile that will be in application-centric mode, where the port would be much more granular than just any permit, where I will block the traffic that is required. So what I want to do is use a module for this. And we're going to see that the module will take some inputs and then can provide some output I can reuse in my Terraform plan, right? So I'm going to just switch here to the new git checkout master.
So Nick, once you've created a module, you can reuse it. That is the function of a module, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically the module there, if I go into the module itself, yeah, I've got a directory. It's exactly the same as a normal Terraform plan file. So you have the Terraform plan, I mean, the TF file and the variables, right? As easy as that. It's just like, it becomes a black box. So you insert this module into your main Terraform file, and then by default, it will perform all the actions that are there, and you can reuse some of the output in your file, right? So let's do this. Okay. If I do now Terraform apply, auto approve, one. Okay, so what it will do is basically, again, provision my new application network profile in ACI and also migrate the virtual machine to that application, right? So now what I should see in ACI is here a new application, prod app 2, that has been provisioned. A new contract as well. If I go into contract there, I should see that standard. I have now web app 2. So I'm going to be using this contract. And now, if I take a look at my EPG, I should see that the VM has been moved into this EPG, right? So now they have disappeared from the first one. Nothing is there. So what I've done, I've created my new application, so in terms of the network with the new ports, security, and I've at the same time migrated my virtual machine in one single action in a declarative fashion, right? Now if I go back to my VMware environment, what I will see two new port groups, and obviously the original VM have been migrated to those port groups. So let's take a look at the configuration file for this. So what time is it? How much time left we have? Like a couple of minutes, I guess?
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
Like 2, okay, perfect. So this one, oh no, let's go to the main file. Okay. So again, now the only difference compared to before is that I'm going to be using this module as an output to put my network into the new EPG. So all of this now, so this tenant hasn't changed, so it's not part of the module, The new EPG is part of the module. And the two outputs I have from the module is just this, right? So this one and this one, so EPG name and application name are only the two outputs I want to get from this black box that my model is. The rest is, I would say, encapsulated into that module, right? So I've exported two variables that I'm going to be using to migrate my VM into those new EPGs, right? That's it. Okay, so I think that's it for the demo. Let's go back to the slides. If I can do this. Okay, here we go. Okay, basically that's it. So any question left? Burning questions? Anything? Yes, question first. Yeah, so the question is, if you delete one resource in ACI, are they going to be recreated? The answer is no, because Terraform relies on the state file. So you would have to manually delete that resource from the state file individually first, and then rerun the plan, right? If you, yep.
Are you sure? Because if you do a plan, it will recognize that it's not here.
No, because the plan is based on the state.
No, the plan does first looking at the resources, how they are now, and what is my state.
Yeah. Okay, but no, the resource won't be recreated in ACI if you were to rerun the plan.
So your question is more to do with, let's say if I change an attribute of a resource, for example, if
yeah, this one is the, yeah.
Your state. Then you do a Terraform plan. And then Terraform looks at ACI, looks at the vSphere environment, and then it checks what the state there is, and then it compares with your current state.
Yeah.
Because it wants to do the difference.
Yeah, maybe for an attribute, but if you if you were to delete manually the EPG in ACI, it's not recreated from.
It works for the attribute, not the entire resource. If you delete the resource, you'll have to do that again.
In my experience, these are
Yeah, attribute should be fine, but deletion, no. I mean, I've done it several times. It doesn't recreate the resource if you were to delete manually. But the way to delete a resource from ACI would be to remove the resource from the plan first, right? Okay, other question? Are we going to support Fabric objects?
Yes. So right now you saw the list of resources, right? If you want to support a Fabric object, we can add a resource for that, or you can use ACI REST for managing Fabric objects.
Okay, any other?
The slide with the ecosystem?
This,
Yes, you had a question.
slide with the ecosystem.
Ansible, you are talking about Terraform. So could you just say a little bit about your
You mean this one? It's not exhaustive, right? So yeah.
Is NSX part of
So the question is about NSX. Is it the right place to ask the question? I don't know. Yeah, there is a Terraform resource there's a Terraform provider for NSXT.
So
No, I think there's no provider for NSXV, only NSXT.
another interesting question came up was, like you have Ansible, you have Terraform. Where do you see Ansible being used? Where do you see Terraform being used? So Ansible, we have had modules for over a year and a half, and a lot of people who are starting their automation of their networks start with Ansible. Terraform is more prevalent in AWS. So people who have their workloads running both on-prem as well as AWS prefer Terraform. And since this is a newly launched module, we are trying to see like what's the adoption, how is it being used. So in terms of Terraform, where do I see it being used in the network? I don't know the answer yet because we've just started that, but Ansible is being used a lot by network operators and people who are trying to start their journey on network automation.
Okay, yep. Yeah, so the question is, can you use both Ansible and Terraform? Typically, yeah, for any resource, you can have what we call a provisioner. And as part of the provisioner, you can use something like a local exec and call an Ansible script, or use a null resource that will trigger, maybe an Ansible script every time the resource is changed, as an example. But the issue with that is again, with Ansible, it's only for provisioning, right? So it won't be managed by Terraform. But yeah, it will be a one-time provisioning. Terraform won't manage what has been provisioned by Ansible. Yeah.
You avoid the mismatch between the API configuration or the API object model and the Terraform model. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just sync the API object model directly into the state?
Like dynamic importing resource. So the question is, how about having a feature that would maintain in synchronization APIC with Terraform? We could do it, but that would be something outside of Terraform, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
You can use Terraform import, I think, but it won't scale.
Yeah, you would have to build some sort of an automation tool on top of maybe leveraging Terraform at a higher level too. But yeah, definitely this is something that is possible. Like get the information of ACI, a particular set of objects, maybe subscribe to them, and then based on that, generate a Terraform configuration or something like that. Yeah.
You could also just do it per tenant, like before you need to push a new tenant, you would just download
Yeah, well, you can do it per tenant.
the state file,
Yeah.
and then you would have the updated state file with
Yeah.
And just a final note, so I know a lot of you would be interested in learning or being hands-on with this. We have a workshop going on later today, and we have some sessions around Terraform as well, a demo in the world of solutions. So please feel free to drop there and check it out.
Yeah. Any question, you can talk to us just now after. Thank you.
Thank you.